Good afternoon and welcome to Metro. I'm Sam Fuqua. Well, according to the New York Times, Israel plans at least another week of bombing in Lebanon. The Israeli army began bombing the country last week in response to a Hezbollah militia attack on Israeli soldiers. As you've heard on the news just now, Hezbollah is launching rockets at Israel. Civilians are dying. Lebanon's public infrastructure is heavily damaged. We have several perspectives on the current crisis and the background of this situation for you today on Metro. Later in the program, we'll be joined by a diplomat from the Israeli consulate in Los Angeles and by University of Colorado professor of religious studies, Ira Chernis. I'm joined in the studio now by my co-host for today's edition of Metro, David Barsamian. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Sam, and we're delighted to have Tariq Ali on KJNU Boulder, Denver. He's an internationally renowned writer, commentator, and political activist. He's based in London, where he's an editor of the New Left Review. He's the author of such bestsellers as The Clash of Fundamentalisms and Bush in Babylon. He and I also did a collection of interviews entitled Speaking of Empire and Resistance. He joins us from his home in London. Thank you, Tariq Ali.
Hello, David. Very nice to hear your voice.
I want to read to you something from the Washington Post written by Robin Wright just on Sunday, July 16th. Robin Wright is a very mainstream journalist here in the United States. She says, for the United States, the broader goal is to strangle the access of Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, and Iran, which the Bush administration believes is pooling resources to change the strategic playing field in the Middle East. Yes.
Well, David, what can one say to talk like that? It's just ridiculous. Basically, what we're seeing in the Middle East is a total destabilization of those parts that had previously been stable. The occupation of Iraq has now created a new situation in the Middle East. The fact that the United States and its allies occupied Iraq and created a new government, destroyed the infrastructure of the old Iraq in every way, means that it is their responsibility, and they have handed over Iraq to the religious Shia groups very close to Tehran. And as I've always made the point, they could never have occupied Iraq without the tacit support of the Iranian clerics. So let's cut out all this talk about axis of evil and all this which mainstream neocons usually come up with, because they needed Iran desperately, the United States, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and the Iranians, for opportunist reasons of their own, decided to go along with it, and now the thing is out of control. Lebanon is, I think, a totally different story. And let me just tell you, David, that about several weeks ago I was in Beirut in the end of May, and while I was in Beirut, I was astonished one day, lying on the beach reading a book, to hear the noise of bombs. So I asked my colleagues, I'd gone to give a lecture there, what is this bombing going on? And they said, oh, you've not read yesterday's papers. And the day before I'd been in Damascus, so I'd missed the Beirut papers. They said the Israeli Defense Force came into southern Lebanon, knocked out two guys from a Palestinian splinter group, killed them, and then went back. This tiny little group then hurled rockets at the Israelis over the border. The Israelis then said that Hezbollah had done it. Hezbollah denied it, saying, you killed their people, they've done it, it's nothing to do with us. But the Israelis then came back and bombed bases of Hezbollah on the border. 50 bombs were dropped, and these are the bombs I heard while I was there. This was not reported, to my knowledge, in a single newspaper in the West. So this sort of thing has been going on. And then the other point, which I think it is important to make, is there are 7,000 Arab and Palestinian prisoners in Israeli gulags. And Hezbollah often use capturing soldiers, they never do it to civilians, capturing Israeli soldiers to use them as exchange fodder to get some of their prisoners released. And the Israelis in the past have done this. So the notion that this is a big Syrian plot to provoke the Israelis is just, it doesn't make sense. I think the fact is that the United States, having pushed Syria out of Lebanon, thought that this is not going to be completed till we've destroyed Hezbollah. Because Hezbollah, without the Syrians, is now the main armed force in the country. And so they green-lighted an Israeli bombing raids on Hezbollah and Beirut after these two soldiers were captured, using it as an excuse to try and destroy Hezbollah. And the timing was very interesting. The Israelis did it while the G8 summit was meeting in St. Petersburg to show the world, here we are, we're doing this, do what you want.
Uri Avneri, who's in the opposition in Israel, says the real aim of the Israeli action is to change the regime in Lebanon and to install a puppet government. That's the main thing, he says. Everything else is noise and propaganda. Well, if that's the case, then that really echoes the Israeli project in 1982 to create a satrap in Beirut.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely true. I don't think necessarily a puppet regime. I think the current regime would do just as well, because this is the regime of the Cedar Revolution, so-called. And I think they would be, a large chunk of it would be happy to work with Israel, except that now it's become very difficult, given that Israel has destroyed the airport, destroyed the infrastructure. Hundreds of people have died in Lebanon. I get emails every single day. So collaboration with Israel by any political group, even the Christian militias, becomes very difficult after this, because the one thing that united all the Lebanese, from Hezbollah to the Phalangists, was that the city was beginning to look nice again, some semblance of normality had returned, and they thought that this was all in the past. Now, if the aim of the Israelis is to say that Hezbollah is really responsible for your suffering, turn against it, it's not going to happen. But I think Avneri is right in the sense that what the United States want in Lebanon, and the Israelis as well, so their interests totally coincide, is a protectorate, an Israeli-American protectorate like Jordan, which does their bidding and which they use as a base of political operations in the region. But I think they've made this very difficult now, and I don't think it's going to work as easily as they thought because of the carnage that the Israelis have wreaked in that country.
Talk about the response of some of the neighboring monarchies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Emirates in the Gulf criticizing Hezbollah. That's been pounced upon by the corporate media here and Bush administration officials in a kind of, see, I told you, the Arabs are divided. They don't like what Hezbollah is doing.
Well, the Arabs are always divided, as we know. You have the Saudi monarchy, you have the Gulf states, imperial petrol stations, as I call them. You have the Egyptian regime, which is one of the most craven regimes in that part of the world. And these are all regimes closely tied to the United States financially and militarily, so their leaders will do what the United States wants them to do. The question is, what do the Arab people think? And I think all the reports coming out on Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera show the real anger inside the Arab world. This anger already existed when the Israelis went into Gaza to try and destroy Hamas, an elected government, elected democratically by the Palestinian people, and the Israelis, once again with U.S. approval, went in to try and destroy this government. The world just looked and watched and did nothing. Then when Hezbollah started responding to Israeli attacks on their bases in the Lebanon, everyone said, oh, this is unacceptable. But what Israel does is totally acceptable. But what the resistance groups in that region do becomes unacceptable, beyond the pale, etc. And I don't take these Arab regimes too seriously. But, David, there is one thing which I think has not been remarked upon and which I think will have some big, big impact in Israel. And, I mean, that's the following, that Israeli television this morning showed 30 rockets falling on Israel, including some on Haifa. No one was hurt. But the fact that Hezbollah or Hamas can fire rockets in broad daylight on Israel is quite significant. This is a country which prides itself on spy satellites in the sky photographing every object larger than 70 centimeters. They have drones, pilotless planes photographing rocket crews launching rockets against Israel. Israel claims the best air force in the world which can hit a car from a mile up in the sky, etc., etc., etc. They have atom bombs. The question arises, how has all this modern equipment helped them to stop Hezbollah and Hamas from firing rockets in broad daylight? And I think this is a very important fact which many, many Israelis will be compelled to think about in the months that come. And let us hope that a majority of Israeli citizens understand that the only way out of this situation, no-win situation, is to reach an agreement with the Palestinians and to abandon Ron and Olmert and Peretz's annexes policies. And that, of course, means a big, big decision by the Israelis to return to the 67 borders, hand back old Jerusalem and the West Bank to the Palestinians. It looks impossible, but even more impossible things have happened in this world. And I think one should not underrate the impact of what Hezbollah has done within the Israeli population. And then there was a report in a British newspaper a few days ago which said that one of their targets was an Israeli command post, which they'd managed to track and hit with their missiles, and they'd also hit an Israeli naval vessel. Now, this is war on a very new level, guerrilla war on a completely different level, and I think this also will have its impact. And the Israelis can go in and destroy Lebanon, but unless they kill the entire population, they're not going to be able to destroy Hezbollah, because the Shias now comprise, in my opinion, a majority of the population of that country.
And has been pointed out that there's been no census in Lebanon since the early 1930s.
No, they won't have a census, because if they have a census, the whole structure of this the state will completely collapse, David. As you said, it's the because the country is essentially a confessional checkerboard. They refuse to permit an accurate census because they are frightened that there is a substantial Muslim and possibly even a Shia majority which is being denied representation in the political system. And so they will not accept that. And they are frightened of having this census. But, democracy, as we've seen in Palestine or Venezuela for that matter, never bothers the imperial powers when they're determined to get their way. So they don't care about that. They just want to defend what they foolishly see as their interests, the Israelis too, and it's creating mayhem in the Middle East.
When I was in Lebanon, I learned about the territorial claim that Hezbollah has raised over an area called Shaba Farms. Mm-hmm. It's a small sliver of territory right where the borders of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel meet in the northeast quadrant there. What information do you have on Shaba Farms?
Well, my information is exactly the same, that this is a part of Lebanon which is still held by Israel, and Hezbollah publicly said that how can they have a peace treaty with Israel as long as Lebanese land is still occupied? And this becomes a very difficult point for the other politicians in the country they can't totally attack Hezbollah for this, because Hezbollah can't be the only one seen to be defending Lebanese sovereignty. So a lot of politicians go along with it and they say, yeah, but we can sort this out later. And Hezbollah says, no, we sort it out before there's any discussion. So that plays a very important part. And the other thing, David, is that the whole question of political prisoners, Arab political prisoners in Israeli gulags, becomes absolutely key. And that, I repeat, is what explains this cat and mouse game Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Force play, kidnapping or capturing their soldiers and saying, fine, we'll return them provided you release 10 of our prisoners, because the proportions are so disproportionate.
How much of what is going on today in Lebanon is connected to the Israeli withdrawal in May of 2000 and the preceding 18-year occupation in which tens of thousands of Lebanese were killed, tortured, wounded during the Israeli occupation? And I should add the creation of a mercenary army, the SLA, the South Lebanon Army.
Well, I think deep down in the collective psyche of the Israeli Defense Force is a feeling that we've got to revenge ourselves. You know, military people who think exclusively in military terms, think like that. I don't think that's the principal reason they've invaded Lebanon at the moment and are bombing it. I think the principal reason is that they felt that with the expulsion of the Syrians, they hadn't finished the job because Hezbollah was still a very strong force. So the key aim is to disarm and destroy Hezbollah if they can and make Lebanon an Israeli-American protectorate and a twin for the Kingdom of Jordan. And that's what they are planning to do. I mean, the point is, as we all know, Lebanon as a country was only created and carved out of Syria by the departing French colonial power because they wanted to have a cat's paw in the region and they wanted to have a base, and that's why they did it. So the French are to blame for all this starting off. But Syria has never been a totally independent power. It's been very dependent on the United States. In 1956, Shamoun summoned the Marines when there was a danger that nationalist groups in Lebanon linked to Gamal Abdel Nasser would come to power. So they tried to stop that. So they've always tried to keep Lebanon under their control. And then they found that this was becoming increasingly difficult, and so the Israelis came in to destroy the Palestinians in the 80s. Do you remember the massacres of the Sabra and Shatila camps, which were carried out by the Phalangists on the orders of Ariel Sharon, who was sitting, getting detailed reports of these killings that were going on? And then you had the long occupation, then Hezbollah drove them out, then you had the occupation of Iraq, and then you had the desire of the United States to topple the regime in Syria because they were worried that some armaments were coming across over the Syrian border and helping the Iraqi resistance, which was true, by the way. So they wanted to have a regime change in Damascus, and they thought they'd do it through Lebanon, and they failed. Syrians are still there, and they failed to disarm Hezbollah, so they are going in to finish the job. My own reading of it is, David, that they're not going to succeed. It's going to be very messy. They will kill a lot of people, and of course, you know, when I say this in the West, people get very uptight, but let me repeat it, that the racism and the racial superiority evinced by the United States in Iraq towards the Arab population is no different from the colonial-style racism of the Israelis towards Palestinians and Arabs. They do not believe that a Western life or an Israeli life is the same as an Arab life. And so they go calmly killing people right, left, and center. And some of the photographs and footage coming out of Lebanon is too painful to watch.
In terms of uniformity of opinion here, as heard and seen in the corporate control media, with very few exceptions, it's pretty much they, Hezbollah, Hamas, bad, Israel, good. Is it any different in Britain?
Oh, yeah, it's not the same here. We've had some very strong television reporting on the Channel 4 News. Even the BBC has managed to be better than it usually is. And the print media, The Guardian and The Independent, two large daily newspapers, have been publishing quite strong stuff every single day. So the media in Britain is not as servile and craven as its counterparts in the United States. I mean, they were shocking even on the Iraq war, trying to recover later. And then they got very freaked out when the London Review of Books published that long text by Mearsheimer and Walt about the Israeli lobby, but they had to then take that up. It did become an issue. something they had never discussed before. And they are now behaving like a lobby once again themselves, just refusing to accept the other side. And the irony of this, David, is, as you and I know, if you look at Haaretz, it has more critical reports in it from Gideon Levy. Yitzhak Lau wrote a very strong piece yesterday. So the Israeli press, or at least one Israeli newspaper, has much better reporting of what is going on than any single mainstream newspaper in the United States, leave alone television stations.
That's been commented on for many, many years. In fact, there's also Amira Haas, a very courageous, independent Israeli journalist, that there's more discussion within Israel on issues than there is particularly in the United States, where it's often difficult to criticize state policies without being defamed and vilified.
This is absolutely true. And I mean, the old trick is that if you're not a Jew, they call you anti-Semitic, and if you're of Jewish origin yourself, criticizing Israeli policies, they call you a self-hating Jew. And they never used to do this, but it shows how weak and defensive they are, that they're beginning to do it. And I always recall the words of the great historian, left-wing Jewish historian Isaac Deutscher, whose next of kin perished in the camps and whose relations lived in Israel. And after the Six-Day War of 1967, he wrote this, David. He wrote, "To justify or condone Israel's wars against the Arabs is to render Israel a very bad service indeed and harm its own long-term interest." He then compared Israel to Prussia, saying you've become the Prussians of the Middle East, and he issued this warning to the Israelis publicly. He said the Germans have summed up their own experience in the bitter phrase, "Man kann sich tot zeigen," you can triumph yourself to death. This is what the Israelis have been doing. They have bitten off much more they can swallow. But that was a time when historians could talk like that and be published in the media. This sort of stuff would be impossible to get published these days.
In an editorial that you wrote in the March-April New Left Review entitled Midpoint in the Middle East, of course this is months before the current events, you wrote that more alarmingly for Washington, American control of the Middle East is slipping. Do you believe that what's happening now in Lebanon will accelerate that slippage?
I think it will accelerate it.
In what
without
way?
Any doubt. Because everyone knows, and I mean, it's not a secret. The one thing you have to say about the Bush-Cheney, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice regime is that they are quite open. Condoleezza Rice went on Fox TV yesterday or day before and said, how can they stop? How can we call for a ceasefire which will return to the status quo ante with Hezbollah still there? And today the headlines in the British press are the United States greenlights another week of Israeli bombing and war, saying you've got 1 week to finish the job. This is like, the Godfather telling a subcontractor, saying you've got a week to do it. If you don't, then we'll have to do something else. It's just horrific what is going on, but at least they admit it. They don't pretend it's going behind the scenes. So American linkage with this has now been openly acknowledged. And of course, we all know that the Israelis would never have taken such a bold step without consulting the United States or even without agreeing a plan of action with them. So it is seen all over the Arab world, and not just there, all over the world at large, as essentially a U.S.-backed Israeli operation into Lebanon to try and destroy a political organization which is represented in parliament, to kill its leaders, to kill its members, to destroy their homes. And if in the course of this hundreds and hundreds of civilians are killed, who cares? These are Arabs.
I guess you must live near the airport in London. I keep hearing the jets overhead. Are you near Heathrow or Gatwick?
I don't normally hear them, but the weather here is so hot. It's 40 degrees today, Celsius, that all the windows in this house and in my study are open. I normally don't hear them. That's why you can hear them. They're not jets off on a bombing raid to Lebanon, David, I assure you.
Yeah, it's equally hot here in Colorado, very dry. Just one final question. Of course, we'd like to end on a simple note. What's the way out? What is the strategy for some kind of modus vivendi so that peoples in the Middle East can live in harmony, can live a tolerably good existence? They don't have to be in love with one another, but how to get there?
In my opinion, three things have to be done. One, the occupation of Iraq has to be ended. That has created just such a great deal of disorder in the Middle East that it's frightening. Secondly, and in a way more importantly, the Palestine issue is not going to go away. And here, David, there are two ways out. One is a retreat to the 67 frontiers. If the Israelis don't do that, even that won't give the Palestinians what they deserve, because they'll have 25% less than they were offered at the UN resolution of 1948. But let's suppose the Israelis go to the 67 frontiers, which seems impossible, then you have the possibility of a state. If not, I have said publicly to Hamas and privately to some of their people in London, what you should do is dissolve the Palestinian Authority, say it no longer exists, and we are all citizens of this entity that is here. Full stop. Then let's see. In other words, make a strategic political leap and put the ball totally in the court of the enemy. Otherwise, this thing is going to go on, and we know that the United States and Israel are militarily very powerful, so they will carry on killing lots of people, and the resistance will carry on replying. So what we need is a political solution, but that will only come when it's recognized that Palestine needs justice. If you don't get it, this will go on.
Tariq Ali, I'd like to thank you very much for your time joining us from your home in London on this, for you, evening. Your new book is entitled Pirates of the Caribbean, Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Fidel Castro. When can we look forward to seeing that out?
Well, that book, I think, will be out towards the end of October, and it's a book essentially on Latin America, where the situation is far more hopeful than the Middle East, David. For one thing, religion doesn't play a big part, but for another thing, real social justice alternatives are emerging in that continent, so I just distracted myself to write something a bit more hopeful.
Thanks very much for your time, Tariq Ali.
Thank you very much.
And you can find out more about Tariq Ali and his work by going to his website, and I should spell out Tariq for you. It's T as in Tom, ARIQALI.com. And you can go there and read that article I was just quoting from Midpoint in the Middle East from New Left Review. I'm David Barsamian. Thanks a lot.